handle the truth.
And welcome, folks. It's February 24th here, 2020, where we have 2020 vision on truth versus news. We give you the straight scoop here on everything. And we have quite a day here on February 24th. The stock market's down 1,000 points. Harvey Weinstein's going up and been convicted. We have to report all the news here. Dr. James Fetzer and Scott Bennett, two of the most prominent researchers and investigators and conspiracy theorists, analysts who have dissected the news. And let's go for it. Let's talk about that Weinstein thing first, Jim.
Very good, Don. Yes, just broke story here. Harvey Weinstein guilty in landmark #MeToo movement. Harvey Weinstein was convicted. Weinstein, I've been told, was convicted Monday at his sexual assault trial, sealing his dizzying fall from powerful Hollywood studio boss to arch villain of the #MeToo movement. The verdict followed weeks of often harrowing and excruciatingly graphic testimony from a string of accusers who told of rapes, forced oral sex, groping, masturbation, lewd propositions, and that's Hollywood excuses from Weinstein about how the casting couch works. The conviction was seen as a long overdue reckoning for Weinstein after years of whispers about his behavior turned into a torrent accusation in 2017, I think over 100.
Yep.
That destroyed his career and gave rise to the #MeToo movement to encourage women to come forward and hold powerful men accountable for their sexual misconduct. The case against the once feared producer was built on 3 allegations: that he raped an aspiring actress in a New York City hotel room in 2013, that he forcibly performed oral sex on another woman. Really, she, I think, performed oral sex on him. Production assistant Mimi Haley at his apartment in 2006, and that he raped and forcibly performed oral sex again and forced to perform oral sex by Sopranos actress Annabella Scaria in her apartment in the mid-1990s. Stunning stuff. Scott, tell us what's going on here.
Well, I was watching a little bit about this morning. They had like 5 counts that they were trying to prosecute him for, and I think he was only convicted on 2 or 3 of them. The most serious ones were he was acquitted or not guilty.
Yeah.
So I mean, the bottom line is he's going to be going to jail. He's going to go to California to face some other criminal prosecution. So he's going to be in jail for probably 20-25 years, according to Napolitano and the judge that does the sentencing. So Weinstein, in a sense, he's getting this, all the stuff that he's built up. I saw the film when I was going to Hong Kong on Weinstein, and it is quite grotesque and monstrous, some of the behaviors that he, engaged in. And, but, Roman Polanski, he did much of the same thing. The other, Jeffrey Epstein, he did the same thing, if not worse. And quite frankly, I think Jeffrey Epstein and his assistant, the lady who was British, her name evades me at the moment, they really need to be prosecuted. This is far worse. I mean, in a sense, I'm not standing up and defending Harvey Weinstein, but these were actresses. These were wannabe actresses. There was a couple that he did, apparently jump in bed with and rape, but most of these women were part of this Hollywood crowd that were trying to get ahead. And in many respects, that's kind of how the culture of Hollywood works. I don't agree with it. I think it's grotesque and perverted and disgusting. But there's some interesting legal things going on in this case, and that is they took, 20 years ago, some episodes he had with women, and they used those as witnesses for this criminal conviction to build up, a character of predation. And there's something that kind of rubs wrong with me about that, because you can't, if no charge is filed 20 years ago, you cannot bring that in as if it has been a charge, as if it has been a criminal behavior, because that's what the courts are for. If you're going to try and prosecute someone, then you have to do it. If you don't, then the statute of limitations covers it, and you can't bring it up 25 years later to add another straw to the camel's back until it breaks. So there's something really, I think, problematic with this New York law that says anything that happened, even if it wasn't criminally charged or prosecuted, you can still bring in as negative evidence to build up a jury against an individual. I think that's a perversion. I think that's a violation of the Constitution, because you're calling someone a criminal when it hasn't been adjudicated. But I think in a sense justice was done with Weinstein. Go ahead, Jim.
Scott, I think you're making excellent points about due process here. And, in most cases, character evidence is inadmissible in a situation like that. You have to prove the specific offense. I'm quite confident the reason for the dismissal of some of the more serious charges is that these women continued to have cordial relationships with him professionally. And of course, this was at the heart of the matter. Their conduct with him was not free and voluntary. It was subject to coercion or constraint because of threats or expectations. Their careers, their professions as actresses would be adversely affected if they didn't accede to his demands for sexual activities that they otherwise would have not engaged in. That seems to me to be the heart of the matter. But that, the jury, I think perfectly reasonably, would be constrained from finding him guilty of these more serious matters when the defense was able to introduce emails, letters, whatever exchanges that showed they continued to have amicable relations thereafter in the context of the profession, their profession as actresses. He is maybe the most powerful producer in Hollywood, so that their careers were at stake. And, we've all heard the stories of the casting couch. He appears to be a real case of a perverted example of the worst of the worst.
Yeah, that's how people get up in the world and get up in Hollywood and things. They got to kiss ass. I'm sorry, but that's true.
Well, this isn't kissing ass, Don. This is a little more.
Well, lastly, let me say one thing. There is something insidious about this, quote, Me Too movement hysteria fever, because it seems to be sweeping large parts of the female population in America up into this fervor, this hysterical rage, to the point where many women are looking into their past and making situations and making themselves victims of situations from a long time ago that at the time they weren't. They're reconsidering it now through a negative lens, and I'm not advocating for any perverse behavior or predatory behavior, but sociologically there's something wrong with this whole mass hysteria that seems to be almost like a cult. And it really does have a Dionysian sort of cult flavor to it, because suddenly you incorporate into this a lot of man hatred, a lot of lesbian agenda items, a lot of, woman power items. And it's very strange to behold on a lot of levels, because it's also causing major alienation and coldness between the sexes, which of course will have negative implications on the nation as a whole with regards to population and our long-term future. Jim?
Well, Scott, I think it has to do with Trump derangement syndrome. They tried to build a case against Trump on multiple grounds, and it's grown and spawned and been fostered and fed by a whole lot of liberal Democratic women who you know, they're now digging deep for everything they can possibly use against him. And a lot of it is rather insubstantial and has adverse consequences of the kind you're describing. So I think you're right. And it's a phenomenon that we would probably benefit from not seeing carried away.
Right.
You know, that's surely what's going on now is we're being carried away.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can get us to the next story, which is a very significant one too. Namely, FEMA's going to hold a mass casualty drill in Ravenna, Nebraska on the 3rd of March. Now, this is very peculiar on multiple grounds. Get this. FEMA will conduct a mass casualty drill involving triaging persons infected by an imaginary pathogen and suppressing civil insurrection among a panicked citizenry, according to FEMA source. A drill authorized by the DHS is scheduled to take place on 3 March in Ravenna, Nebraska, an isolated community home to fewer than 2,000 persons. FEMA selected Ravenna because of its remoteness, because of media's unlikely to catch wind or take interest in government exercise in a podunk middle America, geographically, virtually in the very center of the United States. The agency is sending 700 full-time employees. That's quite a large investment to Ravenna, some of whom will role-play victims of a hypothetical sickness, eerily like the novel coronavirus that's infected at least 42,000 and killed over 1,000, mostly in China. The rest of FEMA's workforce will portray a Gestapo-like police force tasked with detaining, interrogating, incarcerating looters and insurrectionists. FEMA will have paid to emulate ransacking the neighborhood and defying mandatory federal quarantine orders. FEMA, our source said, will pool volunteers from among Ravenna's population. Scott, one of the aspects I find most peculiar is these events have to be planned months, even years in advance, and nevertheless it's simulating the coronavirus, which has only recently emerged, suggesting this is part of deep state conspiracy to manage and control the population. The CDC, he added, is coordinating with FEMA on the exercise. At least 15 CDC physicians will be on the scene to evaluate and treat persons affected with the pretend virus. Some civilians will receive forced inoculation, which is alleged to be a placebo, of sterile water, harmless fillers, preservatives, adjuvants, and stabilizers. One of the concerns some of us have is that the coronavirus is being generated to enable mass inoculation, where the inoculation is the actual killer, not the virus.
How about that?
We're going to have color-coded vaccines, a red, yellow, and green. Green for the sheeple, the workers who don't ever speak out and work dutifully and believe everything the government tells them. The red for those who speak out like you or me or Don and are going to have a very abbreviated life expectancy after our inoculation. FEMA Acting Director Peter Gaynor, DHS Chairman Chad Wolf, and CDC Deputy Director Ann Schulop will be on the site to evaluate FEMA and CDC's performance, our source said. That's a lot of brass present for a simple training exercise. I can't recall the heads of 3 agencies attending a field event like this before. FEMA's triage units will be located in Anavar Park, home to the city's tractor pulls, demolition derbies, and other rural recreational activities. Gaynor, who's the acting director of FEMA, obtained permission from Ravenna Mayor Peg Deathlifts and Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts to temporarily transform the park into a medical ward and staging area, from which the agency will practice combating virulent pathogens and violent offenders. This all smells like a smokescreen for something bigger, our source said. Absolutely. I am not privy to all operational details, but I know when and where it will take place, and that it coincides with the explosion of the coronavirus makes all this very fishy. The agency is rife with subterfuge, and Gaynor is evil incarnate and incognito. I fear for civilians who get rounded up into this exercise. For all we know, FEMA and CDC might actually infect them with a coronavirus. We just don't know.
That's right.
In closing, the author of this article views all FEMA exercises with a great deal of suspicion, for it's spent billions of dollars over 5 decades planning to wage war on the American citizenry in hopes of depriving us of constitutional freedoms, ranging from free speech to the right to keep and bear arms. Remember, we have all those FEMA camps all over the country. It could be we're on the verge of the occasion for actually using them. Scott, your thoughts about what's going on here?
Well, it's interesting that they do this in Nebraska. I'd say it's a little bit of a lower, not IQ necessarily, but you know where I'm going. There's a little bit less bustle and hustle, and there's less, dynamic industry in Nebraska. It's a little bit more sedentary. It's a little bit more, Bible Belt, middle of the road country. So it's a place where they can go out and sort of practice, perhaps, on operations that are going to be held in the middle of the country, targeting perhaps some of these states. So Nebraska is a good practice zone. And let's remember, for military training, these exercises are done to desensitize the staff, to desensitize the agents, the government, the practitioners, to the sounds and the sights and the screams and the protestations, and even the armed resistance from this sort of a thing. These are miniature military practice routines and rehearsals. I remember that from the Army: rehearse, 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 rehearse every operation, so that it becomes muscle memory. And that's what these sort of events do. They inculcate, they desensitize muscle memory, almost on a military regimental level, to these agents and practitioners, so that they're hardened to it. So I wouldn't be surprised, as you identified earlier, Jim, that inoculations, mass inoculations, start rising. Start being given to children, or try to be given to children. Hey, we just have a new inoculation that just came out from Big Pharma that is going to defend against coronavirus. So add this to your inoculation that your kid needs to get, or else they can't come to school next year. Be prepared for these sort of events. And the more, I wish they weren't happening, but the more they begin to insidiously encroach into life, I have a hard time coming away from the conclusion that we're not in a civil war, that we're not in a deadly struggle for our lives, our bodies, our health, against all agents, agencies, government, politicians, bureaucrats, police, whoever you want to call them, emergency services, even doctors and Big Pharma. All of these agents, whether they know it themselves or not, are opposed to our right to life, and life abundantly, that God gives us, not government, not the United States of America, not California, not Wisconsin, not Seattle, not China, not Russia, not Fiji. No nation, no people, no land gives life to a human being but their divine creator. And we are witnessing man's meddling and corruption and perversion of the created order. 5G is another example, but these sort of virus practice incidents are very, very alarming, and they should be objected to. They need to be vocally objected to and filed against, so that the powers that be see there are men in America that will not go quietly. Jim?
Well, about the same, I'm going to get you, Don. Same community in China where the virus is originating is also where 5G was initially introduced. It also seems to me, if you're in 5G is known to have the effect of adversely affecting your immune system to make you more vulnerable. I'm told coronavirus is equivalent to the ordinary cold virus. It's just with a weakened immune system, you can't cope with it as you ordinarily would. And if you're going to undertake a world depopulation program, where better to begin than in the world's most populous country, China? Don.
Yeah, amen to all that. Boy, and essentially, coronavirus is just a new name, a new technical name for a cold. And essentially, we have It's all being done through FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. They manage emergencies, and they manage Sandy Hook and a lot of other ones. And it looks like it's all been fake news and trying to get an agenda rammed through. And if they try to inject you with things, well, it's done with by the Center for Disease Control. That's CDC, disease control, not disease cures. They're not looking for cures. They're looking to control people. What better way to control diseases than to inject them and essentially cull the herd and do what they want to get in power. And this is a desperation time for that deep state. The Trump has sort of trumped them, and they're having their last throws, and they will take down everybody they can with them if they go down. And 5G is just right in there.
I'm worried that you might be spot on here, that the CDC has become an instrument for, actually even not just controlling the U.S. population, but for weeding out dissidents and eliminating them. It's very serious in its potential scope and application.
Afraid so, man. It's a new world here, brave new world. Go
then we turn to what ordinarily would have been the lead story. The gloves come off in Nevada. It was a rock'em sock'em combat. Billionaire New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg was a recipient of most of the attacks. He came out very tattered and torn. It was devastating. Some have said they'd never seen such a feeble of a debate performance. There's a serious issue here. Bloomberg arguing Trump would defeat any Democratic opponent who favored abolishing private health insurance. That, of course, directed against Bernie Sanders. He and other candidates sparred over healthcare, socialism, climate change, other topics. Near the end, a moderator asked whether the candidate with the most delegates by the time of the convention should earn the nomination, even if they didn't have the majority. They were all opposed except for Bernie. The question is made important considering what could happen if the convention goes to a second ballot. If Sanders or anyone ends the first with less than 50% of the delegates, the 500 superdelegates could turn everything inside out. During the Iowa caucus, former DNC chairman from South Carolina, Don Fowler, said he opposes limiting those superdelegates as they were in 2016. If the DNC should regenerate that fight in a national convention, the result would be the most hellacious fight you've ever seen at the Democratic convention.
Yeah.
It was after the Bernie protests in 2016 when the superdelegates guaranteed Hillary on the first ballot that they revised the rules that they could only enter on the second. And if they now want to revise it to let them vote on the first, there's going to be quite a monster struggle. Meanwhile, former skeptics are warning of a brokered convention nightmare. Many Democrats who were initially skeptical of the prospect for a brokered convention now see it as a more likely scenario with this large number of candidates. One Democrat who worked on 2 campaigns for Obama called a brokered convention the biggest nightmare Democrats can imagine. If you want to see a complete show, tune in to the brokered convention. Adam Parkhomenko, who worked on former Secretary of State Clinton's 2016 campaign, said, "This is currently heading for a convention fight at this rate. If the number of candidates scoring in the double digits that are splitting delegates continue to do so through Super Tuesday and beyond, it's just math until all of a sudden a number of candidates drop out, and we can expect quite a few after Super Tuesday, though possibly not before." While campaigns say they're focused on the upcoming primaries, they're quietly thinking more about building out their team in the event a brokered convention takes shape. The reason most candidates seem unlikely to suspend their campaigns before Super Tuesday. If it's Bernie or even Warren on one side, 3 or 4 moderates on the other, all with delegates, the odds are the moderates would have enough to team up and hold off a Sanders nomination, providing, I think, that they coalesce among a single candidate. In 2016, Sanders battled Hillary until the very end and vowed to take the fight to the convention, but the DNC managed so that he was unable to carry it forward. He's won a big vote in Nevada, stretching his lead in the Democratic race. Sanders has been able to broaden his coalition beyond the narrow limits of leftist voters. He brought in lots and lots of Latinos and blacks, and even those in the unions who had declared that they liked their own health plan better. Many of them also voted for Bernie. He was comfortably ahead with half the precincts voting, with 46%, followed by Biden at 19%. Look at the enormity of the gap. Buttigieg has called on Bloomberg to drop out after the debate. Former South Bend Mayor Buttigieg has called on Mayor Bloomberg to drop out of the presidential race in a memo warning that Bloomberg's presence could propel Bernie Sanders to the Democratic nomination. If Bloomberg remains in the race, despite showing he cannot offer a viable alternative to Bernie, he will propel Sanders to a seemingly insurmountable delegate lead, siphoning votes away from Pete, the current leader in delegates. Well, of course, he's no longer the leader in delegates. Not only that, but Bernie is leading in California for Super Tuesday, and in California, it's winner take all.
Yeah. Isn't this just tempest in the teapot? Because it looks like Trump's going to get them all. I mean, he gets more people to his rallies than the votes accumulate on the other side almost, right?
John, we're talking about the Democratic primary, not the general election.
I know, yeah, but
Scott.
Go ahead.
Well, the political rallies, and this one in particular, the Democrats, but all of them are the equivalent of the Roman day Colosseum of the mob going, throwing goblets of wine and spitting and screaming and bread, being cast to them to satiate them. People lose themselves in a mob mentality. They have a fervor, they have a hysteria, that kind of energy swells up. So there's a lot of explosions that happen at these rallies in these events. It's combat, it's political combat. I was part of the Bush 2004 events, and it is an army against army. And you've got Sanders, you've got Buttigieg, you've got Klobuchar, you've got Bloomberg, you've got Biden. You've also got Tulsi Gabbard in the background, who you and I have said from the beginning, Jim. I like Tulsi Gabbard. I wouldn't vote for her for president. I don't agree with a lot of her beliefs and her principles, but I do believe with her attitude towards war, her attitude towards the military, her attitude towards Syria and Iran and Russia. I agree with her on that, because soldier to soldier, officer to officer, we have a kindred spirit in our filtration and our analysis of war and combat in the Constitution. And yet that very thing that could get the Democrats elected, if they focused entirely on the wars around the world that we've unleashed for 20 years and destroyed our reputation and our bank accounts, and have alienated America as the bloodthirsty giant that's stomping all over these poor little brown people in mud huts in North Africa and in the Sahara deserts and all this stuff. If the Democrats focused entirely on that and got away from the socialistic, impulse, I think they could very, very easily win, because Trump is finding himself surrounded by betrayers and traitors who are stabbing him in the back. And he's not done what he promised to do on that level. Anybody can cut taxes. Anybody can cut the bureaucracy. Anybody can write executive orders that talk like Ronald Reagan. Hell, we'd all do that if we were in the presidency. But pulling us out of the military-industrial complex and fighting against the warmongering, people is another issue. Trump has failed to do what Reagan did, getting up on the bully pulpit like Reagan did every day, not every day, every week or so. He'd get up on TV and say, "My fellow Americans, I need you to call your members." Trump has not done that, and you need to do that. There is a quaint, old-fashioned connection between the people and their president. He does have a good one. I'm not knocking him on that, but I'm not a yes man, so I'm always going to tweak the nuts that are loose and tighten up the screws that need to be tightened to make the machine run better. I'm not about complimenting people, I'm about making them better. And Trump needs to be made better in these ways, and starting with getting rid of the bad people around him who are traitors. And also, I think Bernie Sanders is going to be the nominee because Biden's an old man. He can't remember his middle name. Buttigieg is not going to have any weight with the blacks or Hispanics who are religiously conservative, and they will not embrace a homosexual man kissing another man. They just won't do it. Despite how Brian Williams and the mainstream media, personalities who make millions of dollars a year and live in penthouses in Manhattan and get on CNBC and MSNBC and all that other jazz, they're not middle America. They're not the majority of these minority populations that vote Democrat. They will vote for Sanders because he stirs up their passions. And if Bernie Sanders got Tulsi Gabbard as his running mate, like we've talked about, Jim, I think he could very easily be in the running, and he could win. But I think the odds are against him. I do say, again, they are going to possibly Manchurian candidate someone, kill someone, assassinate someone to try and lurch ahead at the last second of the last inch of the race to pull people to the Democrat side. And that could come at the Democrat convention. It could come, just a matter of weeks before the election. Jim?
I think the only candidate who would possibly play that role would be Bernie himself, Scott. I mean, Bernie's the one who excites passion. If you had Bernie running with Tulsi adds so much more to Bernie than Pence adds to Trump.
Yeah, that's right.
You have really greatly strengthened the Democratic hand politically. Tulsi's just a sensational candidate. She's so well-spoken. She has this wonderful background. She's such a thoughtful, attractive candidate. I mean, I just enjoy hearing her when she's being interviewed.
Yeah, I
because
do too.
She's so much in control. She is so responsive. She's so spot on the target that even though I disagree with her on various issues, as do you, especially, say, the Second Amendment, we agree wholeheartedly with her and Bernie about the Middle East. In the Donald is showing some signs. He's talking about getting us out of Afghanistan now, the longest war in our history. And I think he's doing that quite deliberately and self-consciously to make him less of a target as one who has failed to fulfill his most important campaign promise. But I do think a Sanders-Gabbard ticket would be the strongest the Democrats could put up. And I'm going to report more on Medicare for all, for example, because a new study greatly strengthens Bernie's hand in that regard. Don, I know you want to add a thought or two.
Just a real quick thought. Bernie's a pretty old man, and he's had a heart attack, and he's just a heartbeat away from not being there. And so where's he going to be in 4 years? Is he going to run for a second term? I think he's not going to be the best qualified person for really having an active life.
I don't think the average American voter cares.
Yeah,
I think the average American voter cares about Bernie because Bernie cares about them.
Yeah,
he is exciting the crowds, Don. No one else, no other Democrat is drawing like Bernie. He's the only one who's competitive with Trump. And therefore, on Scott's assassination scenario, the deep state would prefer to take out Bernie because he's the greatest threat to the deep state and the establishment and the elites. So I think on Scott's scenario that it has to be Biden is so useless. Biden is so insignificant. Assassinating Biden doesn't make a drop in the bucket. It's insignificant. And none of the others add up to a worthy target, frankly. I don't see anyone else there. The only way it could go, sad to say, because I like Bernie a lot, would be Bernie. And here's that study I was telling you. New study shows Medicare for all will save Americans billions and prevent thousands of unnecessary deaths. This is very significant. A new study conducted by the Yale School of Public Health, University of Florida, and University of Maryland School of Medicine, released in the medical journal The Lancet. This, by the way, out of UK, is the oldest medical journal in the world. Shows Medicare for all would save money and lives. The U.S. would save 13% in the national healthcare expenditure, prevent more than 68,000 unnecessary deaths every year. That's roughly $450 billion in savings every year. by replacing premiums, deductibles, co-pays, out-of-pocket costs with a progressive tax system. Medicare for All will not only save the average family around $2,400 a year, but give lower income families access to services they need. Advocates for the bill like Bernie Sanders applaud the new study, saying, quote, "This study confirms that Medicare for All will save the American people $450 billion on healthcare costs, will prevent 68,000 unnecessary deaths each and every year." In other words, guaranteeing healthcare as a human right by creating a Medicare for All system will cost substantially less than our current dysfunctional healthcare system. It will save working class families thousands of dollars. It will prevent tens of thousands of Americans from dying each year. While the CEOs in the pharmaceutical and health insurance industry may not like it, we will end their greed and enact Medicare for All when I am president. Meanwhile, this is the other side of the coin, and I'm not sure quite how to assess it. Sanders tells New York Times he would consider a preemptive strike against Iran or North Korea.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders has won the popular vote both in New Hampshire and Iowa presidential primaries, in considerable part by presenting himself as an opponent of war. Following the criminal assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani last month, Sanders was the most vocal of the Democratic presidential aspirants in criticizing Trump's action. His poll numbers has risen in tandem with his stepped-up anti-war rhetoric. He has repeatedly stressed his vote against the 2003 invasion of Iraq, reminding voters in Iowa, "I not only voted against the war, I helped lead the effort against the war." In speaking with the foremost newspaper of the American ruling class, however, the New York Times, the Sanders campaign adopted a very different tone. The answers provided by the campaign to a foreign policy survey published this month by the Times gives a different picture of the attitude of the self-styled Democratic Socialists. In the course of this survey, the Sanders campaign is at pains to reassure the military-industrial intelligence establishment and the financial elite of the senator's loyalty to U.S. imperialism and his readiness to deploy its military machine. Perhaps most significant and chilling is response to the third question in the Times survey. Question: would you consider military force to preempt an Iranian or North Korean nuclear or missile test? Answer: yes. A Sanders White House, according to his campaign, would be open to launching a military strike against Iranian or nuclear-armed North Korea to prevent, not respond to, not even a threatened missile or nuclear strike against the United States, but a mere weapons test.
Yes.
This is a breathtakingly reckless position, no less incendiary than those advanced by the Trump administration. Meanwhile, Chris Matthews, Dems may be better off with Trump reelected than Sanders taking over the party. Fascinating. The thought of Vermont Democratic Socialist Senator Bernie Sanders taking over the Democratic Party is terrifying many party leaders and influencers, to the point that MSNBC's Chris Matthews thinks some secretly want President Trump to win re-election so they can rid themselves of the so-called Bernie bro wing of the party. Meanwhile, Bloomberg is working on how he can secure a second ballot nomination. Las Vegas, Mike Bloomberg is privately lobbying Democratic Party officials and donors allied with his moderate opponents to flip their allegiance to him, Mini Mike, and block Bernie Sanders in the event of a brokered convention. The effort, largely executed by Bloomberg's senior state-level advisors in recent weeks, attempts to prime Bloomberg for a second ballot contest at the Democratic convention in July by poaching supporters of Biden and other moderate Democrats. According to two strategists familiar with the talks, the outreaches involve meetings and phone calls with supporters of Biden and Buttigieg, as well as uncommitted DNC members in Virginia, Texas, Florida, Oklahoma, and North Carolina, according to one of the strategists who participated in meetings and calls. With Sanders' emergence as a forerunner in the presidential primary, Democrats in those states have recently raised the prospect the Democratic Socialists could be atop of the ticket liability. In other words, that the Democratic candidates for the Senate and the House could suffer if Bernie were at the top of the ticket. There's a whole operation going on, which is genius, said one of the strategists. It's going to help them win on the second ballot. They're telling them that's their strategy. It's a presumptuous play for a candidate who hasn't yet won a single delegate or even appeared on a ballot. And it could also bring havoc to the convention, raising the prospect of party insiders delivering the nomination to a billionaire over a progressive populace. Other candidates have quietly been in contact for months with superdelegates, the DNC members of Congress and other party officials who cannot vote on the first, but none have showcased it as a feature of their campaign, as did Hillary in 2016. Meanwhile, Bloomberg is sacrificing major segments of the electorate for the general election. Old McBloomberg had a farm, but he's killed the farm vote. He's killed the black vote. He's killed the women's vote. He's not a good prospect for the general election, as Don was implying previously. Yeah. Scott, your thoughts?
Real quickly, can I interject that I guess Bloomberg and Bernie, I think they both have religious affiliations with the Jewish beliefs, and I think they have a dual allegiance with Israeli.
Don, I think you're completely wrong. Bernie is a Jew, but he puts America first. Okay. I'd rather have a Jew who puts America first as president than a non-Jew who puts Israel first. That's one of my problems with Trump. I admire him on so many grounds, but having a foreign policy dictated by Bibi Netanyahu is unacceptable to me.
To me too, yeah.
Yeah, well, I would share the concern of Bernie Sanders in this remark about taking a strike against Iran and North Korea because again, you're provoking us into war, and anything can happen in war. Russia, China, and the entire world can side against us in war, and we can't affect that. There's no timeouts. There's no truces in war. And that's why the founding fathers recognized only the people of the United States could take us to war. And, the military adventurism around the world should be severely and drastically and immediately restrained and cut by leaders who are real men of the Constitution to say, we are not going to be engaging in military tours around the Pacific, around the Atlantic, around the North Sea, around the Persian Gulf, we're just not going to be all over the world. How much is this costing us? And it's totally unconstitutional. Bernie Sanders, I would like to think he puts America first, but I don't trust anybody. He could be a liar. He could be, saying things like this in order to take an action on behalf of Israel. But I have seen some of his comments, and he seems to be critical of Israel. But that's easy, for him. But I think, in one regard, we're on the precipice. Democrats have always been socialists and communists and tyrants at heart. Democrats use government to coerce, intimidate, manage, threaten populations and people and cultures into a grotesque perversion of utopia, which only ends in dystopia and misery, whereas Republicans and conservatives have always allowed people to live their lives, do what they want within the confines of freedom and liberty. And the founding fathers recognized that. We have lost our original liberties and abilities to thrive and prosper. We've lost them under the Democrat mantle of licenses and certifications and on and on and on and on, to the point where we really are a shadow of what we were as a society 50 years ago. This society today, the young people today, the families in America today, I reflect often on my documents and papers when I was at the Heritage Foundation, and we studied in deep the correlation between family and marriages in a healthy society. It's precisely because of the disintegration of family and marriages in the 1980s and 90s that we have this dystopia and this schizophrenia and this sexual madness and transgenderism and all of this stuff coming out that is only going to create a more confused, violent society, and I think fracture America into more pronounced, civil war and tribalization. So Bernie Sanders is a typical Democrat socialist who will use coercion and government tyranny to push his agenda. But albeit I agree with some of the things he's done, I'm glad he opposed the Iraq War in the beginning, but this is now, that was then. And it really comes, how is he going to be engaging the world in the future? I would hope it would be disconnected, but again, I don't think he's got a chance. I don't think he's got a prayer. I think everything is abandoned. And Bloomberg, of course, has been totally shattered by his own Harvey Weinstein past and history, and
Right.
his alienation from the rest of the electorate. There's nothing attractive about Bloomberg. There's nothing attractive about Elizabeth Warren. She's a liar, and she's a vicious, angry woman who you saw that when she was attacking Bloomberg. And Klobuchar and Buttigieg are just political opportunists. The only ones that really are up there out of a sense of, I think, duty to the country is really Tulsi Gabbard. I think she's the only one who's serving out of a loyalty to the country. And Bernie Sanders, because he's just got that passion in him, and he believes what he says. But again, the American people don't believe him. They believe Donald Trump, I think, in vast majorities. Jim?
Well, I'm really worried what the report itself might have been an internal sabotage of Bernie's campaign. I mean, it doesn't sound like anything he would actually support if he thought about it. After all, the preemptive attacks are only permissible under the UN Charter if you have either the permission of the UN Security Council or there's an imminent threat that requires an immediate response. A missile test is not per se an immediate threat. And just as I've suggested, Trump is vulnerable to an impeachment article based upon
Yes.
the violation of the UN Charter to which the U.S. is attached by a treaty that has the same status under the laws of the Constitution itself. The same would be true of Bernie Sanders were he president to undertake such an action. So I find it anomalous, inconsistent with his overall approach to foreign policy, and therefore I wonder whether it isn't somehow an attempt to discredit him. Don, did you want to add up further?
You're doing fine.
Okay.
I can't object.
Meanwhile, in furtherance of your observation, Scott, that Donald seems to be in control, Senator Tim Scott predicts Trump could get 15% of the black votes in 2020. We had a previously Rasmussen poll showing that by their analysis, up to 34% of black likely voters would be supporting Trump. No way the Democrats can win with that kind of support for the Republican candidate. Think about this. President Trump got permanent funding for the historic black colleges and universities for the first time in the country's history. This president is not simply talking about going after every single vote. He's actually doing the work to get every community in this nation focused, not on what the Democrats promised, because their track record is abysmal. He's delivering to the black community. CNN sources, meanwhile, this intel deputy, you heard the reports that Russia's backing Trump. Well, it was more bullshit. Intel deputy overstated claim at briefing that Russia is planning to help Trump in the election. To understand this Jake Tapper thread, you need to have read the Washington Post and New York Times articles claiming Trump decided to oust Joseph McGuire as acting director of national intelligence because he believed mistakenly that McGuire's deputy gave Adam Schiff a secret briefing about something having to do with election security that Democrats might be able to use against him. Schiff received no secret briefing, a source told the Post. The full House Intel Committee was briefed with the Republicans present, but they were very disenchanted. The election security official told lawmakers that Russia's interfering in the 2020, this is not 2016 now, 2020 presidential election on behalf of President Trump does not have evidence to support those claims, report CNN, not known to be partisan in favor of Trump. Intelligence doesn't say that, one senior national security official told CNN. A more reasonable interpretation of the intelligence is not that they have a preference, it's a step short of that. It's more that they understand the president is someone they can work with. He's a deal maker.
Yeah.
Shelby Pearson, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Election Security, in a private briefing with the House Intel Committee, said Russia wanted to see Trump reelected since it viewed his administration as more favorable to the Kremlin's interest. So it's this Shelby Pearson guy who's spreading the nonsense. The New York Times first reported on the briefing. Another Intel official told Syrian Pearson's characterization was misleading. Another said it lacked context and nuance. Trump's national security advisor O'Brien said he's seen no intel to show Russia interfering in the election to re-elect Trump. All I know is that the Republicans on the side of the House hearing were unhappy with the hearing, said there was no intel to back up what was being said. But here's the deal. I don't even know if what's been reported as being said by the briefers is true. You know, those leaks are coming out of that hearing. Meanwhile, more fake news. Media push the false claim Trump offered Julian Assange a pardon, quid pro quo. Former California Republican Congressman Damon Rohrabacher has denied he acted on orders from President Trump to offer Julian Assange a deal for a pardon, saying he never spoke to the president about the offer. Rohrabacher's claim calls into question accusations made earlier by a WikiLeaks attorney who alleged Rohrabacher was acting on instruction from President Trump to offer clemency to Assange if he confirmed Russia wasn't involved in leaking Democratic National Committee emails during the 2016 presidential election. Mainstream outlets, including The Post, The Guardian, Reuters, and the AP, ran with the initial allegation, printing sensational headlines implicating Trump, even though some of them acknowledged in the reporting Rohrabacher denied he was following orders from the president. In a recent interview, Rohrabacher said his goal in meeting with Assange in 2017 was to find proof to support the unsubstantiated rumors, except it's massively substantiated, that slain DNC staffer Seth Rich was a real source of the DNC leak, not Russian agent. He said he never spoke to President Trump about the proposed deal. I spoke to Julian Assange and told him if he would provide evidence about who gave WikiLeaks the emails, I'd petition the president to give him a pardon. Yep. But Assange couldn't do that because it would violate WikiLeaks policies. And if you want to know about the role of Seth Rich, here's a book about it, my own, exposing the Russia hoax. An easy introduction, only about 132 pages. And then you can turn to Greg Jarrett's masterpiece, The Russia Hoax, for further substantiation. This was an effort to undermine the Trump campaign and to delegitimize a president that was run by the DNC, Hillary Clinton, and corrupt elements within the Department of Justice and the FBI, sad to say. Scott, your thoughts?
Well, you know, I'm working on an article for Sputnik right now outlining all of the people who have been engaged in criminal activities in the political world for the last 30, 40 years.
That's
and
massive.
Trump, yeah, it is massive. And, you know, I'm narrowing it down, of course, but, you know, Russia and America and the relationship has a very unique history because as Ronald Reagan passed into history after being attempted to be assassinated by Hinckley, the shooter who was affiliated with George Bush Sr.'s family. And Jim, you can correct me on some of these things if I get it slightly wrong. But Hinckley related to George Bush. George Bush, of course, related to the Kennedy assassination. Kennedy being assassinated because he opposed the military-industrial complex and the presence in Vietnam, which Johnson got us into by an executive order, not an act of Congress. But all of this continued. And when Reagan left, he had a vision that America and Russia would at last kind of unite, would have a friendship, would have a non-hostility renaissance of culture. Because Reagan was a conservative and Americans were conservative right. They believe in family, they believe in moral values, they believe in God and religion and tradition, and the American people do and the Russian people do. And it was, you know, under Clinton that we tried to cannibalize Russia, and we propped up Yeltsin, and we gave hundreds. I found, you know, in all of my moves, Jim, I found a report by Cox. I'll have to get into it with you. but Cox had written this exhaustive Republican analysis of Bill Clinton and Gore's sending hundreds of millions of dollars over to Russian government officials who were just like Ukrainian officials, and they siphoned it to mafia.
Wow.
And Russia imploded in many regards because of the U.S. Clinton government, Madeleine Albright, attacks, military, economic, diplomatic, Yugoslavia, and all these things. So Russia has right to be skeptical of the United States, but they're really not. And when you look at Putin and listen and watch his quotes, and you look at all the other things about Russia, it is not a threatening society at all. And yet the threat is the military-industrial complex, the mainstream media, which is communist, and they hate Russia because Russia grew out of communism and rejected communism, and now is trying to create its own orthodox expression of capitalism. But Russia is hated by so many, including the neocons and the Zionists, for Newt Gingrich and others. And H.R. McMaster and all of these people who have surrounded Trump have constantly have been trying to push him in that direction. And I think it's failed, and I think Trump recognizes that, and we're going to see eventually a renewal of the American-Russian relationship. H.R. McMaster, this is another very important story, Jim, we need to discuss. Eric Ciaramella, who we've discussed as the whistleblower, that H.R. McMaster, the national security advisor of Trump, brought back into the White House. Eric Ciaramella and H.R. McMaster and all these people that have stabbed Trump in the back, Reince Priebus and all these others, Rand Paul on the floor of the Senate called out Eric Ciaramella, and YouTube took it down. YouTube forbid and stopped Rand Paul's questions or
That's
statements.
incredible. A United States senator in the Senate announcing the name of the whistleblower, and YouTube would take it down. Damn YouTube. That's disgusting. That's ridiculous. That's un-American. That's undemocratic. YouTube, you are bastards for that kind of action. Bastards.
And let me finally say that really needs to be held and exposed more and more. We can't let that go under the rug. But the other thing on Trump is all of the blacks are going to increasingly go towards Trump because at heart they're very happy, jovial, conservative people. And the moment they start seeing their lives get better with jobs, opportunities, materialism, and Trump has a very easygoing way about him because of his business practices. So he can engage fearlessly and talk to blacks fearlessly, man to man. And they appreciate that. There's an honesty, there's a presence, there's a realism to Trump when he talks to blacks that nobody else has. There's a plasticity to the others that came before him, but not with Trump. So that's why Salt and Pepper and Kanye West and these other blacks, I think you're going to see a swift boat black equivalent rising up and engaging in political advertisements to the black community and to the white liberals too. This is the key. Blacks can move white liberals away from the Democrats. Blacks can move white liberals to vote for Trump by saying, look, we're not here to be told what to do or how to do it. We're voting for Trump. So you white liberals that think we're just a bunch of coconut eating, monkeys in the trees, we're not. We're Americans, and we're holding you accountable to say, vote for Trump. And I know that may get people.
Hold that thought. We're having to go to the break. Don.
Yeah, February 24th, this is Truth versus News. Come back for the second hour, which is going to be even hotter than this hot hour. Yeah, so you take care, and we'll be coming right back. Okay, what's this here?
I didn't mean to cut you off, Scott, but
quite all right.
Don had been giving me the time limits.